Well, thank you, Stephen. There's nowhere else I would rather be than in the company of Point Reyes Books, so I should say I'm based in Atlanta now. I'm sending my greetings out. I'm delighted to see so many people from across the U.S. out into Australia. The book ends with some really amazing Australian flowers, extraordinary co-evolutionary stories from there. So I send greetings for springtime or autumn, depending on which hemisphere everyone is in. And I should say that it's a particular thrill to be here with Stephen, who welcomed me, as he said, nearly a decade ago for an in-person event, and then we've done various things through the pandemic and after the pandemic online. And I've got to say, Point Reyes Books has got the most extraordinary collection of really thoughtfully curated books, some of which, I mean, it's the list of all my sort of all-time favorites, but also books that I hadn't heard about, that hadn't hit my radar screen. And so it's a place that I look to as guidance for how to find our way through the plethora of amazing books and in doing so, support hubs of community. And one of the themes in this book is that flowers are community builders. They're, along with a few other creatures like trees, the real champions at building networks. And uh, independent bookstores are that in the human community, drawing not just through drawing the minds of writers and readers together, stitching these amazing networks, but also in terms of drawing actual human connection and human friendships, which we need more than ever in this time of dissociation and disembodiment. So thank you to Stephen, Molly, and all your amazing team, Point Reyes for Point Reyes Books. And I'd encourage you, those of you who are tuning in, if you haven't yet got this book, or perhaps you don't want to get it, but order another book from Point Reyes. This Zoom is provided for free. Stephen is offering his time for free, and so we need to support books to keep these events going. Okay, so thank you all. Great to be with you. I'm going to talk, of course, about how flowers made our world, the story of nature's revolutionaries. Out today, this is literally the first event I've done on this book. I've done a few interviews. You can listen for Science Friday, those in the US. There'll be an interview with me. Well, it's live online already. It'll be on the radio later this week. But the title seems a little preposterous, right? Flowers made the world, and flowers are revolutionaries. We think of flowers more as like, well, they're ornamental, they're pretty, we love them, but they're not particularly consequential to making the world or to sort of revolutionizing things. And my goal with this book is to say, absolutely, flowers belong at the center of the story of how our world came to be. And the book is a celebration of that. It's puzzling over some of how they came to be such revolutionaries. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that here in a minute. And then also to think a little bit about how flowers are interwoven and entangled with human culture in some unexpected and extraordinary ways. From the origin of humans, we wouldn't have evolved, we wouldn't exist without flowers, and flowering plants to this day sustain us in terms of our agriculture. Most of our calories are derived one way or another from flowering plants. But also the origins of biological classification and evolutionary biology, how we express ourselves collectively and individually through perfumes, through decorative arts. So flowers pop up all over. And to me, this is an indication that they're deep down in our collective and individual subconsciouses as well. So we'll get into some of that, and the book certainly gets into that. The other thing I think flowers do is offer an alternative narrative about revolution. So revolution in the human context is often thought of as quite violent. I grew up in France, and of course, French Revolution was a bloody affair, and it wasn't just one affair, it was sort of multiple upheavals, and that's true of other human revolutions. But, within humans, there are other sorts of revolutions that are not so bloody and maybe go under the radar of the media. And of course, Rebecca Solnit, in my view, is the person who's telling that the most effectively these days. So I'd encourage you to connect with her her latest book and also her entire body work to think about revolutions in the human context that are not about just beheading the king and shedding blood on the streets. Flowers, for 100, at least 130 million years, have been revolutionizing the world through cooperation, through beauty, through illusion, through inner genetic revolutions in ways that I think we, although we're not flowers, we might have something to learn from. So let me start with a little reading to give you a sense of the vibe of the book and so on, what's going on. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages here and then talk about a few of the themes. And as Stephen said, I'm eager to hear your questions and your thoughts. And so we'll go for maximum another 30 minutes and then open things up. So I'm going to read from the opening chapter, Magnolia, and I should mention, not just mention, but absolutely highlight that as I'm opening this, you can see beautiful artwork opening each chapter. This is the first of my books in the US that has had any inner illustrations in them. These illustrations are by Lucy T. Smith, who's an extraordinary botanical artist who works she's based in London. She's worked in Kew Gardens. She has her own book called Botanical Sketchbook that you should check out. All sorts of insights about botanical art. And here you can see the not just any magnolia, but the southern magnolia with its little anthers fallen into one of the petals there. So we're starting with magnolia. A delicious aroma announces summer's arrival in Atlanta. In front of office buildings in Midtown, my nose plunges into sweetened almond and tangerine, then resurfaces in a miasma of truck fumes. The scent brushes past me, too, in the scuffed lawns of city parks and along shady streets in older neighborhoods. To find the source of these delights, I look up. White flowers the size and color of porcelain dinner plates sprout from the branch tips of huge southern magnolia trees. A plume of scent streams from each bloom. These aromatic trails dance like ribbons in a breeze, so I can never know when one will warm me with its touch. Over the next month, this scant first bloom will grow. By June, a large tree can have 100 or more flowers open at the same time. The delights of magnolia flowers are portals into deep time. When Tyrannosaurus stomped through subtropical forests of the late Cretaceous, magnolia-like plants had been thriving for 50 or more million years. If magnolias were rare animals, they'd be corralled into theme parks, at the center of movie franchises and central characters in thousands of children's storybooks. And on Netflix, as we just heard. In the floral world, we don't need a dinosaur movie. We live in one. The Earth's first flowers left traces of pollen. The Earth's first flowers left traces of pollen in the fossil record about 130 million years ago in the early Cretaceous. Studies of DNA suggest that flowers evolved before this, between 150 to 250 million years ago. This is astonishingly late in the evolution of life. Most of the major groups of complex animals evolved 500 or more million years ago. The first plants, none of which had flowers, came onto land at about that same time. Flowers were latecomers, but when they finally showed up, the party really got going. Within a few million years of flowers' appearance, perhaps as few as 3 million, the family tree of flowering plants splayed into almost all of the main branches that are still with us today. By 100 million years ago, flowering plants were flourishing all over the globe, and by 90 million were dominating not only the understory where they first evolved, but forest canopies. Truly, this was a revolution. In a few million years, the green-brown world of tree ferns, conifers, and ancient plants was overthrown by the flowering newcomers. Plants that had dominated the land's surface for 300 million years were suddenly in the shade of upstarts. Nothing was ever again the same. Most ecosystems are now founded on flowering plants. Our own species would never have evolved without them. We're sustained today by floral gifts, from the food on our plates to the perfumes on our skin. The Earth is a floral planet, and although we seldom realize it, we are a species almost entirely dependent on flowers. Magnolias offer us an especially clear view of the revolutionary early days of flowering plant evolution, because although modern magnolia species all evolved in the last few million years, they are little changed in their overall structure from more ancient times. Archaeanthus, for example, a plant known from 96.5 million-year-old fossils, would not look much out of place in the magnolia grove of a modern botanic garden. And when biologists reconstruct a hypothetical ancestor of flowers by mapping floral characteristics onto a genealogy of living species, the speculative first flower is like a magnolia bloom, a shaggy bisexual, female atop male in a bowl of petals. For flowers, the term bisexual differs from its meanings among humans and refers to the presence of both female and male sex cells in the same bloom. In a bisexual flower, petals serve both pollen and eggs. This union of female and male into one structure was, as we shall see, a brilliant move, one that allowed flowers to work collaboratively with insect pollinators. Glimpsing the earliest days of floral evolution offers more than a fun moment of time travel. We are transported to early scenes from one of the most consequential stories in evolution. When I sink my nose into a magnolia bloom, I'm face to face with an ancient revolutionary. And then we have a section break and move on to a little discussion about the nature of innovation, because our culture loves hero narratives, right? The singular person who invented something. Well, Thomas Edison's light bulb was invented by a team of researchers in a lab, not by a single individual. Same is true with flowering plants. There is no single innovation that defines them or allows them to explains their extraordinary success. Instead, it was a convergence of elaborations of existing botanical features and a few novelties added in for good measure. So in this convergence, that's how flowering plants became so successful. So genius, in a way, is a weaver's art, drawing together multiple strands rather than coming up with the singular idea. So revolution. So magnolias are an example of flowers that are somewhat like some of the earliest flowers. What happened to the earth? Well, as I mentioned in the reading, most major habitats today are founded on flowering plants. Before flowering plants, there were no rainforests, there were no prairies, mangroves, seagrass marshes, salt marshes. Temperate forests were completely different. I mean, think of a temperate forest with the maples and the oaks and the sours and so on. Those are all flowering plants. And so most of the major habitats we have today, including human agriculture, are founded on flowering plants. They also catalyzed the evolution of entirely new animal dynasties. Bees did not exist before flowering plants. They evolved in response to the appearance of flowers on this planet. Same thing with butterflies. Grazing mammals did not exist until grasses, which are a specialized kind of flower, until grasses evolved. So bees, butterflies, grazing mammals, Homo sapiens also, because our ancestors, they were little small-brained apes living in trees, probably living quite satisfied lives there, but a few of them were restless and moved out into the savannas, which are grasslands. These are ecosystems formed entirely by flowering plants. And the diet of those pre-human hominins was almost entirely made up of the seeds of flowering plants, especially grasses, and the animals that also ate those grasses. So we owe flowering plants our own evolution. And before that, primates probably wouldn't have evolved without fruits and all the insects that live up in the trees. Birds became much more diverse. Beetles, flies. If you look at the evolutionary tree of most major groups of animals on the planet now, when flowering plants evolved, boom, there's this explosion, this great flourishing and branching out of diversity. So remove flowering plants and flowers from this planet, and you lose most of our major habitats and large groups of animals. By creating rainforests and by stabilizing the coast and mangroves and salt marshes and seagrass beds, uh, and creating prairies that store a lot of carbon, flowering plants also change the climate. So without rainforests, of course, we don't have as much rain. And without those carbon stores, there'd be a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. So in a way, flowering plants are quote unquote geoengineering the planet in a way that created opportunity for other creatures. Okay, so there were lots of consequences of this revolution. The question is, though, how did they do it? I mean, plants had been on land for hundreds of millions of years. What was it that flowers had that allowed them to so swiftly? I mean, it really is extraordinary in 3 to 5 million years for an obscure group of plants to basically take over the planet. Well, I think there are three ingredients to their success. Actually, there are more, but we're not going to go all night on this. But these are the three big ones. The first is flowers figured out how to speak the language of beauty to animals. They opened channels of interspecies communication, which plants had been doing below ground with fungi and microbes, but flowering plants took that above the ground, and by modifying leaves into petals, and a petal is a visual advertisement, it has a special electrical field that insects can send, and the surface of a lot of petals are also aroma diffusers. They're covered in little conical cells that are releasing aromatic oils to the air. Not bad for a modified leaf, right? So by deploying these advertising billboards, if you like, plants figured out how to speak directly to the desires and to attract the attention of animals, particularly insects, but not only insects, also birds and mammals and reptiles and others, because birds were around long before, well, at least a few million years before flowering plants evolved. So by speaking this language of beauty, flowering plants massively increased both the specificity and the efficiency of pollination. So, for example, now there are some fig plants that release one particular chemical that speaks to one species of wasp, and that wasp goes right to the flower of that fig and pollinates it, and it goes right to the flower of another fig, and not wasting its time on other flowers, and the fig gets pollinated in an extremely efficient way rather than releasing absolutely gobs and gobs of pollen to the air and hoping that they will drift over to find the uh, the stigma, which is the receptive female part of another plant. Okay, so by speaking to insects and animals in a way directly tuning in to the nervous system of animals, flowering plants opened amazing opportunities that also catalyzed a lot of evolution because once you're a flowering plant in relationship with an insect, if one of those flowers has a mutation in the aroma or in the color or the form of the flower, maybe you suddenly start talking to another insect and boom, you've got almost instant speciation happening. So that's one reason why there are 300,000 species of flowering plant around the world, is that they're extraordinarily good at self-diversifying. Bisexuality helps with this because by having female and male in the same flower, you guarantee that the incoming insects can both bring pollen and take pollen away. Whereas before, and most plants before separated male and female functions on different plants or on different parts of the same plant. And insects have very little reason to go to the female parts of the flower, right? There's no pollen, and pollen is a great protein snack. And usually there was no nectar either. But a bisexual flower, you've got maybe some nectar, but even if you don't have nectar, you've got pollen, which is incentive enough for most insects to come because pollen is very nutritious for those insects. So bisexuality also was a catalyst. All right, so beauty and speaking the language of animals is one way that flowering plants were revolutionaries. The second is enhancements in botanical motherhood. And flowering plants did this in two ways. First, they wrapped every single seed in what we now call a fruit. So the ovary of the flowering plant matures into a fruit. So fruit, when you eat a cherry, you're essentially eating a mature flower, right? Because that was the ovary that then matured into the fruit that we might eat. But fruits aren't just fleshy. Some of them are dry or and form pods that explode. Some can float. Some attract animals in various ways. Some are resistant to fire. Um, so the fruit itself was this amazing innovation that helped little baby flowering plants get an edge on other plants because all other plants, some of them don't make seeds, but the ones that do make seeds, once a seed leaves the parent, it's on its own. It's basically naked. Good luck, kiddo, sending you out without much help. Okay, so fruit is one thing that flowering plants invented that helped them. The other form of motherhood that really got enhanced in flowering plants is inside the seed. If you were to look inside a wheat kernel, at the bottom of the wheat is the little embryo, right, which formed when the sperm cell from the pollen met the egg that was inside the flower. Sperm meets egg. The egg decides whether the egg is basically in control at a chemical level. Is this union going to happen? If it does, an embryo is formed. We all know that story. That's where we came from. Uh, Sperm, egg, embryo. Flowering plants added another thing, which is from that pollen grain, there is a second little sperm cell that swims down the pollen tube. And instead of meeting an egg, this second sperm cell unites with a couple of ladies in waiting cells that were hanging out around the egg. And they all join and make this little sibling. So it's like a sort of mini embryo, if you like. But this embryo never forms roots or leaves or any plant structures. All it does is fatten up with starch and oils and proteins that the mother plant pumps into it. This is called endosperm. And actually, in a wheat seed, that's like most of the wheat. And if you open a bag of flour, if it's white flour, what you're looking at is ground up endosperm, which the function for the plant was not to feed us, but that endosperm is the food hamper that the little embryo is going to use when it germinates. So if you plant wheat or corn or rice, it lances up like a rocket ship. In just a few days, its seedling is like this tall. It didn't do that by photosynthesis. It did that by eating its doomed sibling, the endosperm, and the embryo shoots up. And so this is another maternal gift. So with the fruit and the endosperm, these little baby flowering plants had an amazing edge. In a way, it's kind of like what birds and mammals do, right? So a bird uh, provides a lot of yolk and albumin and so on to help its little babies grow really fast. And then the parents are stuffing food into that little beak when at least in some birds, the babies stay in the nest. And then, of course, in mammals, we have not only the placenta, which interestingly, the embryo and the endosperm form a placenta-like structure when the embryo is growing, but also the gift of milk, of lactation from the mother coming down and feeding the little babies to help them accelerate their growth. It's not exactly the same, but that the mother plant is taking all her ability to photosynthesize and build food and so on and giving it as a really concentrated superpower to the little babies. All right, so speaking the language of beauty, enhancements in botanical motherhood, which are amazing revolutions. And the third one is one we can't see, and that is inner genetic revolutions. I mean, now with fancy genetic equipment and so on, you can see it. But for centuries, of course, humans knew nothing about how DNA works and all the rest. Well, it turns out flowering plants are amazing at going through what I think of as genetic storms. This is when the genome, instead of regular old natural selection, where there's a little mutation that improves something and natural selection enhances that and it spreads through the population. That's all cool. It happens a lot. I'm not dismissing that standard form of natural selection. But in flowering plants, they've got a whole nother level, which is they go through these storms where they double their entire genome. So instead of having 2 copies of every chromosome, they got 4. And the 2 copies can just run the rest of the plant. Yeah, just make leaves, make fruit, do all the regular work. That leaves 2 extras that can mutate and explore and figure out new ways of making aromas, or let's redesign the petals, or let's invent some new physiological biochemical trick, or let's just duplicate an existing gene so we can pump out more of that particular protein. So this genetic storm supercharges genetic diversity, and diversity is the foundation of adaptation in evolution. And so flowering plants, because they got very flexible developmental biology, they can put up with a certain amount of genetic shenanigans and experimentation in the way that, say, mammalian embryos can't, right? So if you double all the genome of a mammalian embryo, it's not going to be able to develop because we're very finicky creatures, as are most vertebrates when we develop. There are one or two genetic storms that happen very early on in vertebrate evolution, but flowering plants go through these storms a lot. There was a big one right before the evolution of flowers. It probably catalyzed the evolution of flowers. So doubling of the genome that allowed those ancestors to figure out how to build petals and aromas and all of that. And then after the doubling, natural selection keeps the good ideas and tosses out all the rest of the excess DNA. So you don't wind up with these like massively bloated genomes. During times of mass extinction, rapid environmental change, stress like droughts and salty soils and new pathogens, these genome doublings are particularly successful. Now, as far as we know, it's like the plants aren't sitting around thinking, oh, a meteorite just hit. We should go through a genome doubling. These doublings are happening all the time. And it's the ones that happen during times of massive stress are the ones that actually get passed on. And so if you look now, geneticists can map out when these happen through times. It's during those times of environmental calamity. And of course, there's a lot more of that happening now. We are the meteorite, if you like, and gene doubled plants are doing actually quite well these days compared to those that have not doubled their genomes. And guess what? Most agricultural crops in their domesticated form are the result of genome doublings or triplings. They've come through those storms. So that wheat that I was talking about, it's got 6 copies of every chromosome because it's actually 3 different species united and produce what we now call bread wheat. Same thing with lots of other crops. Okay, so we got these genetic storms, and it's like a cross between a rave and a corporate brainstorming retreat. Provides innovation. You got enhancements of motherhood, and then you've got beauty. Those are the 3 superpowers that I think flowering plants bring to the table to account for a lot of their success. And their success then resulted in ramped up levels of cooperation within ecosystems. Some of those are direct, like pollination, or a bird gets fed by eating the fruit of this plant and it helps the plant by dispersing the seed. So that's a very kind of one-on-one cooperation. And then there's more diffuse cooperation, which is sort of, flowering plants, quote unquote, invented rainforests by evolving into these rather fast-growing plants that are amazing at moving water through their bodies. That's another result of genome doubling, by the way, that plants improve their plumbing system so they can move massive amounts of water up to the leaves and keep the leaves happy so they can photosynthesize all day. Most other leaves have to close up when things get tough and hot. Flowering plants can move tons of water through their body, which changes the rainfall pattern. So by internal changes in plumbing, these flowering plants created rainforests. And that once that rainforest forms, it creates indirect opportunities for lots of other productivity and diversification. So this is basically flowering plants, not because they were intending to through natural selection or sort of directed evolution in that way, but as a consequence of their productivity and innovation, opened opportunities for other species. So let me mention now just a few themes that I think that come out in various parts of the book. One is cooperation, and another is illusion and deception, and those 2 things are closely linked. So cooperation, I've talked about some examples. Another really interesting form of cooperation is with both the living and the non-living parts of the world with grasses. So grasses we often don't even think of as flowering plants because they're pollinated by the wind, so they don't make conspicuous flowers, but they're flowers nonetheless. Grasses are the green Prometheus because they invite fire down toward them, at least many of them do. So grass grows all this flammable material and then instead of letting it shed at the end of the season, it lets it stand. So the slightest little lightning strike will ignite that dry grass and burn the prairie. The grasses grow by sneaking their little sensitive growing tips and all their embryonic tissues on or under the ground so they don't get killed when the fire comes over. The brambles and the tree saplings and everything else gets wiped out. So the grasses are cultivating and, in a way, domesticating fire for their own use to create habitats in which they can thrive and other plants are kind of pushed to the side. Later on, after grasses deforested parts of the planet by working with fire, which is a form of evolutionary agency, right? They may not have consciousness in exactly the same way we do, but they have intelligence and agency nonetheless. I mean, managing fire over tens of millions of years to create habitat for yourself is a pretty smart move. Then grazing mammals evolved. There were no grazing mammals before these grasslands opened up. And then you have the evolution of things like horses and zebras and so on, whose teeth, whose guts and everything are evolved pretty much to eat grass. And a grazing mammal is kind of like fire. Chews down the grasses, wipes out the brambles and the saplings. The grasses come back with a nice little dollop of fertilizer amid the ash. Wonderful situation for them. So the grasses have hired their own groundskeeping crew, if you like. So there's this three-way symbiosis or reciprocity, if you like, between fire, grasses, and grazing mammals. And then we are a later beneficiary of that, right? Because many of the habitats that our ancestors evolved in were grasslands. And we still, to this day, in many parts of the world, use fire to manage grasslands to our own benefit. And now conservationists are using fire to manage grasslands to bring back endangered species and so forth. So that's another form of sort of cooperation. And then agriculture is deeply cooperative. I mean, we have become the diligent servants of grasses and other plants to the detriment of some other wild species, but nonetheless, there are more wheat plants now in the world than there ever were. So flowering plants, their genius is to build interactions, usually by working with the sensory proclivities of different sorts of animals, enlisting animals as their helpers and changing the world. Now, along with that comes some deception. For example, orchids. Many orchids are sexual mimics. So the orchid flower looks and smells and feels just like a female wasp or a female bee, depending on the species. And the amorous male wasps come along and they're like, try to mate with the flower, and they're just wasting their time. And they get a little daub of pollen put on their head. They fly on to the next flower, and not having learned their lesson, they then transfer the pollen to the flower. So the orchid is using its pollinator, giving it zero benefit, and in fact, wasting its time in order to get pollination services from it. There are other plants that just kill their pollinators. Jack in the pulpit, a plant that grows in eastern forests, quite common. It should be called Jack and Jill in the pulpit because some flowers are male, some are female. The pulpit is a sort of tube-like structure with a little overhang, and then there's a spadix, a little column, which looks like a preacher standing in the pulpit in the middle. These flowers smell just like rotting mushrooms, which not very attractive to us, but if you are a fungus gnat, a little fly that eats and lays its eggs in mushrooms, you're like, this is great. I'm going to fly into this flower, and the sides of the flower are all slippery, and you fall down, and you're trapped, and you get dusted with pollen if you're in a male flower. It's like, oh, I'm covered in pollen. There's no mushroom here. It's like, this isn't so great. And then, oh, there's the exit hole. I'm going to leave through the bottom of the flower and fly off. And then you fly into a female flower. Oh, the walls are all slippery. I'm falling down in here, and I'm putting my pollen on the female flowers. as the pollen falls off, and now I'm stuck. It's like, dude, where is the exit hole? There is none. The little fungus gnats die. And the plant doesn't even have the decency, like a pitcher plant or something, to digest the gnats and get some nutrients, some nitrogen out of it. They just die in there. So this is a plant that kills its pollinator. Other manipulations, not quite so extreme. Citrus flowers, right? They smell lovely. They're loaded with nectar. Bees love them. But it's not just nectar in the citrus flower, like an orange or a lemon flower. There's a little bit of caffeine, not enough to taste bitter and deter the insects, but enough to give them a buzz. And this caffeine actually helps the insects associate the nectar with the reward and to be more enticed to come back to that particular flower. So this is a form of chemical communication, chemical manipulation. And that, yeah, that's all right. A little caffeine buzz, nothing wrong with that. But this caffeine actually makes the insects stick with going to the citrus flowers longer than they would have done without the caffeine, and they start ignoring more rewarding flowers around them. So the caffeine is like basically luring in pollinators, and yeah, the pollinators get some reward, they get some pollen and nectar, and that's all good. But their economic decision making has been shifted towards the citrus plant and away from the insect self-interest, which is to visit citrus as long as it's rewarding and then go off and visit some other flower after that. So we are surrounded by deceptions as well as cooperations. And for centuries, people have looked to quote unquote nature for allegories about how humans should behave, right? So the social Darwinists were like, nature is red in tooth and claw. It's all about free market competition, and we should let the poor starve because that's natural and good. Or the alternative, nature is a commune where everyone's just helping everyone else. And it's basically like what Americans imagine Sweden might be, except with better weather. So all full of cooperation and reciprocity. Both of these stories are true. Flowers tell us not so fast. Stop projecting your human values onto other species and then reading those other species, imagining that nature is giving you a moral lesson. Instead, I would argue we need to marvel at the diversity of contrivances and relationships out there, that cooperation and craven exploitation can exist at the same time in the same flower often, and then figure out how humans should treat one another and how we should arrange our human economy using our own ethical precepts from humans, not saying, well, we're going to be like the orchids or the Jack and Jill in the pulpits or the magnolia flowers, whatever it is. So I think flowers for me are deliciously complicate some of the morality tales that occasionally we like to read into nature. And let me close also by saying, sort of zooming back to humans. At the beginning, I said we kind of dismiss flowers. They're pretty, they're ornamental, but we don't think of them as powerful as world changers. And I think that is very much true in our culture. But also, I think we understand deep down that flowers are actually creators and life givers. So at almost every major life transition we go through, flowers are present. When people woo one another, when we welcome babies, when people get married, when we bring offerings to an altar in a place of worship, often there are flowers. When we bury people, we bring flowers to the grave. And people have been putting flowers in the grave along with their loved ones for at least 12,000 years. There's archaeological evidence from caves in what is now Israel of people laying Judean sage and other flowering plants inside graves. And when we put on floral fabrics or perfume ourselves with floral perfume, we are expressing our individuality by becoming chimeric, by saying, to be more fully me, human, I'm going to merge with you, plant. And so my identity is better expressed as a we that includes flowers and me, and somehow that feels more true to us. So I'd encourage you in the coming days to look at all the different ways that flowers manifest not just in the world around us, growing on the roadside ditches or in flower pots or in garden centers or in fields or our gardens, but in human culture as well. And to think about the meanings of those flowers, how they sometimes box flowers into very narrow cultural roles, like often the perfume industry in the West, at least, boxes floral perfume as only feminine, whereas for thousands of years, floral perfumes, in fact, in many other cultures, have been both masculine and feminine, and both, and all sorts of other gender identities as well. Um, and in other ways, that flowers are emerging, and we think of them as ornaments, but actually, they're indicating something very, very deep about who we are. And this is flowers' original genius, is to make the world by dissolving the I into we, by unselfing individuality into community. That's what flowers have done. That's how they built our world. And that's how they will build the world to come in the future. We humans are, who knows what our fate will be, but in 100 million years, there will be flowering plants on this planet, uniting with whatever animals are around, cooperating with fungi and microbes, and causing the world to continue to bloom. So I'll leave you with that thought and would be delighted to take any questions, comments, refutations that people have. So thank you.
Thank you, David. One of the things I love about your writing is that you are a scientist, but you are willing to extend yourself into, one of the fun chapters of your book is speculative futures, where, as you just touched upon, thinking forward into the thousands and then millions of years,
Mhm.
what might happen and what might come. I'll have a couple questions, but I want to get to other people's first, since we do have a couple of questions. We'll start with Michael, who asks regarding your citrus plant comment. He says, "So are they addicting the bees with caffeine?"
Yeah, I mean, addiction is a little too strong a word. So that they are tipping and tilting the behavior of the bees. I should also add, I mean, there's a lot of interesting new chemistry coming out of studies of nectar, because there are also things that flowers put into nectar that are really good for their pollinators that help the pollinators get rid of parasites and all the rest. So nectar is sugar, but it's also kind of a drug cocktail. And as you would expect in evolution, the flowers are going to tip that cocktail to their own benefit, but also add some things that might be helpful in there as well. Yeah.
Maria asks if you traveled extensively to study flowers around the globe in their natural environment for your research, and if so, which having read the book, I could say yes, you've traveled. Could you talk about the most spectacular or unusual place you visited, if there is one standout or many
Okay.
standouts?
Okay. The most spectacular place that I visited is the busted up, cracked concrete of my own driveway here in Atlanta. This is concrete that's probably getting on for 100 years old because the house is 100 years old. And just yesterday, I counted a dozen flowering plants emerging from one crack in the concrete. Some were from Asia, some were from Europe, some from here in the Americas. And to me, that is a sign that is like living hope. That even out of the cracks in the concrete, you got this extraordinary diversity. I love, and I particularly love the miniaturized flowers with you need to get down with a hand lens or use your phone to zoom in. And suddenly it's, wow, this world in miniature is just the most extraordinarily beautiful thing you've ever seen. So that's one amazing place. Let me mention two others really briefly. The second is seagrasses. So my family live in Scotland, and so I should say with the travel for this book, I mostly tried to, with the exception of one or two trips, I only did travel locally and when I was going someplace for some other reason, like to visit family, right? Because I think more and more that we need, if we're writing about the environment, we need to be actually believing that climate change is an actual crisis and behaving accordingly. So visiting my family in Scotland over many years, I learned about seagrass, which is a flower that blooms underwater and which is amazing enough. They're not actually grasses, they're a different family of plants. They've been underwater for at least 70 million years, and they store 50 times more carbon per acre than the most lush forest. So those are extraordinary plants. They're also cradles of biodiversity. And then the last one is a place I have not been, but is in the book, which actually breaks my rule. To this point, I've never written about places I have not visited. But I do talk about southwestern Australia as an example of a place that has extremely old, weathered soils. It's quite hot and a lot of fire. And in places like that, in the Cape region of South Africa is another one, another place like this. Over millions, tens of millions of years, flowers respond to those incredibly difficult conditions by producing massive amounts of nectar from extraordinarily exuberant, extravagant flowers. So what do flowers do when the world gets really, really tough? They just go for it on strewing the world with flowers. And I think there is a hint of a future tens of millions of years hence in some of those environments. And those are places one day I would love to visit. But extraordinary diversity of flowering plants.
That could tie in maybe with a question from David who asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned about flowers during your research?
That is hard because so I read 500 different scientific papers. They're all in the bibliography in really, really small print at the end of this. The most surprising thing, I mean, I should know this because I've been being interviewed by journalists for the last week or two. Um, to me, it wasn't one thing, it's a way of thinking. And I already use this term is to think about agency from the point of view of flowers. So flowers do not have nervous systems knotted up in craniums the way we do. So their agency and their intelligence manifests in a much more decentralized way. And what the conscious experience of that is, we don't know. But thinking of flowers as active participants in conversations, minute by minute conversations with one another and with other beings, really sort of reframe just how I experience the world. And that, I thought along those lines plenty before. I mean, those of you who've read my previous books know that, but flowers seem like there's such hubs and concentrations of plant intelligence and decision making so that was something that really did uh, change my day-to-day experience of um, of life. And one to me that an extraordinarily surprising sort of fact is the swiftness of flowering plants' takeover of the planet. For for them, for this planet to be dominated by non-flowering plants for essentially 4 to 500 million years, probably more like 400 million years. And then within less than 10 million, for there to be a complete turnover, to me, that I had no idea. And in fact, nobody did because the fossil record until recently was fairly poorly known, just how quickly that transformation happened. So that's astonishing. And to me, that's something we culturally should know that this world was, I mean this sort of somewhat arrogant title. Seriously. I mean, it's not arrogant about me, it's arrogant about the flowers, that they really did make our world through these revolutionary events. And man, botanic gardens should be telling this story, natural history museums, which mostly are just about, you walk into the American Museum of Natural History in New York, there is not a plant in sight. It's just two dinosaurs fighting to the death underneath an inscription from Roosevelt about manhood. So it's about violence and masculinity, and that's natural history. I mean, I realize that comes from a particular point in history. That place, the rotunda was built as a memorial to Roosevelt, who had a lot to say about manhood. Um, and so it's okay to acknowledge that history. But yeah, we need flowers up front and center in our scientific but also cultural understanding of what is this world that we're on. We're on the floral planet. That to me sounds like that's that's cool. I want to be part of that story.
Well, there's, yeah, amazing way to think of it, and I wonder sort of the ephemerality of flowers, in a way, might contribute to that, right? The
Yep.
solid, remnant of a dinosaur or the cast of a
Mhm.
dinosaur is so imposing, but that's something so literally close to the ground and often in many cases is so transformative.
Yeah, and flowers, of course, are. It's amazing that, flowering plants, their defining feature, the flower, usually lasts just a few days, and yet they manage to change the world. I should say that, this whole bias against honoring plants and particularly flowers is a very old one. If you look at European Paleolithic paintings, fewer than 1% have any plant life whatsoever in them. In other places like the American Southwest, the Australian Kimberley, there are more plants represented, but still, even there, it's very zoocentric. And we're animals, and so we respond to creatures with faces and that might eat us or that we could eat and get a protein hit. So I get it. It's not that we have to get rid of our love of dinosaurs, but I'm glad that there's some magnolias in the Netflix specials on dinosaurs.
It was nice to see, and like nice that I had some knowledge based from on your book to be able to
Yeah,
explain
right.
why that flower was there to my 7-year-old. Nicole asks, well, this is both a comment and a question too. I can imagine that writing about scent, often thought of as a mute sense, is challenging, but you, David, do it quite beautifully. What pointers might you give to writers who seek to describe the way different blossoms might smell?
Thank you, Nicole. Is this Nicole Brown?
Yes.
Yeah. So Nicole Brown is someone who's an amazing poet and also someone who's written a lot about aroma and has taught me a lot about aroma. So my suggestions is first to pay attention. In fact, that's 90% of the suggestion is unless we are actually taking time to be in that aroma, to just experience the layers and to try and put some words to them, maybe, but mostly, the sense of smell goes directly to the hindbrain, bypasses all this kind of like language stuff, which comes later. So just be in the presence without trying to solve the literary question. And note that aromas change as through the minutes. Like when you bite into an apple and first smell it, this or a cup of tea, the aroma has a story arc to it as well. So um, paying attention through that, and of course, some people are anosmic from birth or because of COVID or because of injury and so on. So this applies to other senses as well, like listening. And I do this a lot with my students when I'm teaching writing, paying attention. And then feel that aroma in your gut and your whole body, and then search around for the words and the metaphors that seem true to you, even if they feel absurd. And those are the ones to use. So that's my practice is first be an experience, which is even just stopping there is mostly what I do because like what's the point of being alive if we're not going to actually be embodied in our senses. And then sometimes I'll write about those and I have to go inside to that memory or even to the presence of the smell in the moment. But often I need just a little bit of space away from the smell so that the words can start to emerge. And I really do, my guide is what feels true to my experience. And I go with that and will fight editors who tell me not to. Although most of my editors are marvelous and don't, I mean, they have good suggestions, and usually it's not about stuff like that. So,
Um, there's some great questions here. I'm going to try to get to everything we can. Let's see. Emily says that she's read all of your books and is looking forward to this one, and that she's curious about your writing process. Could you tell us a little about how you came up with the idea for this book or how your others? I'm curious too, how did you move from your one plot of land, which
yeah.
someone, brought up as, kind of aligning with the crack in your driveway, focusing on one
Yep.
spot and then going from there?
Yeah, well, process is maybe too grand a word for it. So no, I mean, so my motivation is to tell the stories of Living Earth, try and decenter myself a little bit, which I realize I've gotten some heat for that because memoir is a really important part of how we should tell stories. And my style has generally been, although I've moved away from that a little bit with this flower book, has generally been to try and put the salamanders and the flowers and the trees out front. And of course, you come to know me pretty darn well, maybe too well. but in an indirect way through reading. So the first book, The Forest Unseen, sat for a year and just watched a patch of forest and wrote essays about that. And that came from my desire to bring a meditative approach to just paying attention to the forest and then using that as a way of telling stories about the eastern forest. And I'd wanted to do that for years, and I just one year decided I'm just going to sit down and do it. That was in a patch of old growth forest, which is great. I'm all for old growth forests. But the next book, The Songs of Trees, I wanted to take that same approach. So one book seeds the next, basically, is what I'm getting to. Is take that approach into cities and sort of areas of conflict and places at the front edges of environmental change and so on, and use what seem like individual trees, but in fact living communities, and return again and again over many years, sometimes hundreds of times to the same tree to listen to the tree. So uh, from the forest mandala, I wanted tree mandalas, if you like. And then by listening to trees, because I really listened to actually listen to the tree and to people whose lives were connected with the tree. If you listen to trees, suddenly you realize that we're on a singing planet, and the earth is rumbling with sound, and the birds and the insects. And how did this earth come to be so sonically diverse? And that's the next book, The Sounds Wild and Broken, which is also about paying attention with our senses. And weirdly, the story of sound on this planet is once flowers evolved, the sonic diversity of the planet really took off. And that was a moment when I was writing that book to realize, wow, why has nobody written a book celebrating the multiple? I was focused on sounds, but I knew there were all these other ways that flowering plants had catalyzed all these other changes. So I need to, I need to write that book because this is an important story for its own sake. But it's also a way into thinking about things like the relationship between beauty and ethics, deceit and illusion. I mean, that's quite a philosophical tangle as well as a biological one as well. What I didn't intend was for this book to be published at a time when I think we all need more flowers in our life more than ever, right? I mean, who could foresee 3 weeks ago what was going to be going on this week, let alone, 6 months ago, a year or two. And I've been working on this book for at least 5 years. Um, but I do think there's something in this book, and I'm not trying to sort of fluff it up as a political book, but there are things in here about time-tested ways of building community, of thriving, of building amazing things like rainforests over 100 million years in the most rigorous competition you can imagine. There is no safety net in evolution. We could learn a thing or two from that, especially in this time where the dominant narrative is the only way to change anything is to seize control and literally violently take the reins and use violence to suppress everything that's in your way, which is, of course, what we're living through now. Um, so yes, so that's another about this book that to me feels part of me is like, why am I publishing a book about flowers at a time like this? And the answer is because we need flowers and the stories of flowers more than ever. We need lots of other things, political action, all the rest. I'm not trying to argue that flowers are the answer to everything, but they are part of they need to be consideration of flowers and of beauty and how we can be active participants in creating beauty for ourselves and other beings is the question before us now. And flowers have some good answers.
Well, and maybe can you tie that in a little bit to the last chapter of the book? You invite us to play with flowers, and to
Yeah.
me, to kind of tie into that answer is, like that we need to play, that we need the beauty. I mean, beyond like, again, any sort of even allegorical
Mhm.
reading of flowers and their importance to the world, but what it means for us to be on a planet that, living on a floral planet.
Yep.
I need to get that on a hat. I mean, that is such a great, several people in the chat bring that up. But what it means for us as a species too, for whatever reason that we may have overlooked flowers, as you mentioned in
Yeah.
art. And as someone mentioned, David mentioned in the chat, often in European paintings, they're still lives. So,
Yeah.
that brings its own kind of baggage with it. But
Mhm.
what does it mean for us to be able to play with flowers, and what, maybe to send us off, what are a few suggestions you might have
Yep.
as we head into spring?
Yeah, so the book ends with a supplement that is an invitation to play with flowers, that picks up on some of the themes through the rest of the book. And these are hands-on activities that you can do at home with your kids or with friends and so on. Some of them are really simple, like pressing a flower in the pages of the book and coming back a few weeks later to see that. That's a delightful activity. And it's a way of actually marking. I mean, it doesn't have to be this book, of course, other books. Um, the bigger the book, the better, in a way. Stack the books up on top of one another. But flowers are such embodied creatures that their work is just ideas, words, and so on. It's actually to get animals to put their little proboscis in, to put their fingers on them, to eat the fruit and so on. And so the supplement is an encouragement in all of that. Some of them are involved, like how do you make moonshine perfume, like rose petals from a rose bush. You can make your own rose water from that in the kitchen. And other practices are much more simple. And I guess the one that there's some about understanding the structure of flowers, right? So which enhances our curiosity and joy if we know how a flower is put together, because flowers are like music. There are a few simple themes, petals and sepals and stamens, and there's too much terminology, but just a few words will get you most of the way there. A few themes, many variations. So it's just extraordinary to learn that and sort of life enhancing. I think the last practice I suggest is just sitting with a flower and consider the world from the flower's perspective. It could be a flower like a cut flower in your kitchen that you got from the supermarket, or an orchid on the windowsill, or a flower out in the garden, or a park somewhere. But really decenter the human and ask, how did this flower get here? Why is the flower structured the way it is? To whom is this flower speaking? And how? And how is the flower's identity, its manifestation of its senses changing as it unbuds and then turns into a fruit? And just maybe some pollinators come by. Maybe it's a wind pollinated flower, and you can see how the wind flows through the amazing sculpture which is a grass flower or some other wind pollinated flower. So give yourself the gift of some time to be really attentive to flowers. And Simone Weil said, that the French philosopher and writer, that attention is the purest form, in its highest form, is a form of prayer, and it's a form of generosity. And I think if we could give more prayer and generosity to the flowers in our world, I think each of us would feel more joy in our own lives, and more curiosity and other life-giving things, but also a more prayerful and generous world in relation to non-human beings, especially plants. I think would be a great outcome. So some of the invitations truly are playful. It's like just goof around in the department store, smelling different perfumes and find some categories and see, look at the ridiculous labeling and marketing on some of them. Some of it is quite beautiful. Others, it's like, how could you, it's like a seminar um, in gendered advertising in the worst possible way, at least for some perfumes, not for all of them. And others are a little more, it's like basically meditations. And anytime you bring meditation in, you're going in deep, through simple practices of just sit with the flower and consider the world from the flower's perspective.